On the top floor of the glass-fronted William Tower, Chicago, appears below like a sparkling painting. Each window reflects the city's story. But Stephen William, the man standing before the large glass frame, sees only a silent void within himself. 42 years old. Stephen is the epitome of success, having built the William Group from a small rented office into a global financial empire. A perfectly tailored suit, a Swiss watch glistening on his wrist, and a glass of rare whiskey placed neatly on a walnut table. Tonight, the master of all-powerful parties is hosting a private cocktail party for the financial and artistic world. The clinking of glasses, half smiles, and empty toasts echo throughout the gilded room. Stephen moves through the crowd with the air of a man who knows all orbits around him. But then, a deep, familiar voice from the bar made him pause. Still the same arrogant Stephen from before. He turned around. Ethan Cole, his old college classmate and secret rival in the business world, was standing there. Ethan's gaze was as sharp as a knife, but his smile was full of hidden meaning. "I'm still the same. Isn't that what everyone wants?" Stephen replied, the corners of his lips curling up slightly. Ethan turned his glass in his hand, his voice steady. "You have everything except one thing. What is it? A real challenge. Not a business, but a person. A person you can't buy or control." Stephen laughed, which was out of place in the jazz music. "People like that don't exist." Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice as if revealing a secret. "I bet you do. If I'm right, I'll invest $50 million in William Group immediately." In an instant, Stephen's eyes changed. He never accepted defeat, much less allowed anyone to challenge him. This wasn't just a joke, but a direct attack on his pride. Conditions. Ethan smiled as if he had been waiting for this question for a long time. Marry someone completely outside your world. 6 months. No real reason revealed. No exit clause. And if I win, you get $50 million and prove once again that you've never lost. A heartbeat passed in the silence. Then Stephen raised his glass, letting the clinking of glasses ring out as a declaration. Deal. But deep inside, a man who always wins a small crack appeared at that moment. He did not know that this time, the bet was not on the trading floor, but on his own heart. That night, the music, the laughter, the lights continued as if no challenge had ever been made. But for Stephen, everything had changed. The feeling of being urged by a challenge that money could not buy. It was both dangerous and attractive, to the point that he could not stop. And perhaps from that moment, a story will make not only him, but all of us wonder. Money can buy everything. But can it buy a heart? Stay with this story if you are as curious as I am about the answer. Don't forget to leave a small a comment about your thoughts, and follow the channel to follow the journey of Stephen William and the woman who will change everything. Because I promise you, what's coming next will be unlike anything you've ever heard. The hum of the party faded behind Stephen as he stood at the marble bar, the weight of Ethan's words settling like invisible chains around his chest. Every challenge had a price in his world, and if pushed far enough, every person could be swayed. Yet Ethan's smirk suggested otherwise. Somewhere out there was someone immune to Stephen's influence, someone who would not bend even for the empire he had built. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, letting the heat burn its way down. 6 months. No escape clauses. No truth. It wasn't the money that drew him in. 50 million was a mere shift in the decimal column of his fortune. No, what lured him was the provocation, the insinuation that his reach might be limited. Stephen William was not a man who accepted limits. Later that night, in the quiet of his penthouse, he sat in his study, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass wall. Files and reports were scattered on his desk, but his attention was fixed on a single thought: the wager. He could hear Ethan's voice echoing in his mind, the sharpness of it slicing through the usual hum of his control. The next morning he summoned Clara Torres, his executive assistant, a discreet and efficient woman. She stepped into his office without hesitation, dark eyes assessing the man behind the desk. Stephen said, "I need you to find someone." His tone clipped but deliberate. Her brow furrowed slightly. Someone? In what capacity? Not for business. His gaze sharpened. A woman. Not the kind you've seen on the covers with me. No models, no trust fund daughters. No one who would be impressed by money, power, or status. Clara didn't ask why she never did. Understood. How will I know when I've found the right one? You'll know, he replied, leaning back in his chair, because she won't fit anything I've ever wanted. For the next 3 days, Clara sifted through profiles, combing through the city's edges, the places far from Stephen's usual circles. Women who worked in schools, community kitchens, and shelters. Women whose names had never graced glossy magazines, whose worlds were held together not by wealth, but by grit. When she returned, it was with a short, neat folder. Just one file was clipped to the inside. Jessica Smith, Clara began. 35. Founder of New Path, a nonprofit providing housing education and job training for the Southside community. No formal connection to finance. No publicized personal life. No social media beyond a bare-bones account for the organization. Stephen opened the file, scanning the minimal resume. His eyes stopped at a small video link. Clara tapped the laptop, and the screen came alive with Jessica's voice. The footage was raw, a community forum poorly lit, crowded with folding chairs. Jessica stood in front, speaking without notes. Her voice was steady low, with a rhythm that demanded attention without asking for it. Her hair was pulled back, her posture unflinching. She spoke of housing shortages, underfunded schools, and the stubborn dignity of people who had been told their entire lives they would never matter. There was no embellishment, no theatrical gesture. Yet the room was silent, except for her words. Stephen found himself leaning forward slightly. He said, his lips curving into something between a smile and a calculation. Clara hesitated. She doesn't seem like someone who, that's the point. Stephen interrupted. Arrange a meeting. Frame it as a potential sponsorship. Tell her I'm considering a partnership with New Path. He closed the file, though her image lingered in his mind. Jessica Smith. She wasn't the type of woman he could buy. She wasn't the type to be impressed by his penthouse views or the gleam of his cufflinks. And that was precisely why she was perfect. However, there was a quiet, unspoken awareness in the back of his mind. For all his precision, Stephen knew this was not a standard acquisition. This wasn't about percentages or mergers. Deep in the part of him that he refused to acknowledge, he wondered if Ethan's smirk had been less of a challenge and more of a warning. Because some wagers didn't end with a clean win or loss. Some wagers left marks you couldn't erase. And Stephen William had just placed his first one on something he could neither predict nor control. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon, under the pretense of a private discussion about a potential sponsorship for New Path. The location wasn't Stephen's office. He had insisted on coming to her world. It was a deliberate choice, one he rarely made. Deals in his experience were won on home ground. But this wasn't deal in the traditional sense. This was the first move in a game he couldn't afford to lose. The rain had stopped just an hour earlier, leaving the streets damp and smelling faintly of asphalt and autumn leaves. Stephen's black Bentley stopped outside a narrow brick building in Southside Chicago. The sign over the door was simple, hand-painted New Path, housing, education opportunity. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of paper old wood and faintly brewed coffee. The floors creaked under his Italian leather shoes. Children's drawings covered the walls, bright houses with crooked chimneys, stick figures holding hands under vast blue skies. On a corkboard, handwritten expense charts listed every dollar and cent, accounted for in careful penmanship. When he entered, Jessica Smith stood near the far wall, speaking quietly to a volunteer. She turned as Clara introduced him. "Mr. William," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, her gaze steady, the kind of handshake that didn't waver or shrink. "Jessica," he replied, taking the seat she gestured toward. "I appreciate you making time to meet." She said plainly that I don't usually cancel afternoons for strangers, though her tone wasn't unfriendly. "But my assistant said you wanted to discuss unemployment programs and literacy initiatives. That's something I'll always make time for." Stephen's smile was faint, almost polite. Small changes can lead to bigger ones. Her eyes didn't soften. "Small changes are fine, Mr. William, as long as they're not meant to be photo opportunities." It was the first hint that she knew the man he was, or at least the type she thought he was. He didn't correct her. Not yet. They spoke for nearly half an hour about New Path's work after school programs, vocational training, and transitional housing. She listened to his questions carefully. Her responses measured, and she never rushed. And then, as if dropping the weight of the true proposition into the room, he said, "I'd like to propose something unconventional." Her brow lifted slightly. Unconventional. "A marriage. For 6 months. In exchange, your organization will receive long-term funding. No strings attached to your work. Total autonomy for your programs." Silence filled the room, heavy and unmoving. A volunteer passing by glanced in, then quickly looked away. Jessica didn't gasp, laugh, or show the outrage he might have expected. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing just enough to make him feel for the first time in years that someone could see past the suit. "Are you trying to buy me, Mr. William? Or are you buying the image of standing next to me? I'm offering an opportunity," he said evenly. She rose from her chair, walking a slow circle around the room. Her fingertips brushed the corner of a framed black and white photograph, children laughing under a water sprinkler in summer. She stopped in front of him again. "If I agree, it's on my terms," she said. "You won't interfere with New Path. You won't control my public image, and every dollar goes where it's needed. I will walk away if I ever feel this arrangement exploits me or my work. No notice." Stephen studied her for a moment, weighing her resolve. "Agreed." She extended her hand again. "Then let's begin, Mr. William. But understand this. You're not the first man to think I can be played. And none of them ever won." Her grip was as unyielding as before. As he left the building, stepping back into the cool, damp air, Stephen felt something unfamiliar, stirring beneath the layers of calculation. He had walked in expecting to begin a performance, a slow game of dominance dressed in civility. Instead, it felt like the first round had already been played, and he wasn't sure who was holding the advantage. Ethan's voice seemed to whisper again, somewhere in the quiet hum of the city, a warning, not a dare. He ignored it. Because Stephen William didn't walk away from challenges, and Jessica Smith had just become the most dangerous one in his life. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, arranged with a precision that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with efficiency. It was a ceremony, stripped bare of spectacle, no press champagne towers, or headlines announcing the union of a billionaire and a woman from Southside Chicago. The guest list was paired to a handful of witnesses, Stephen's legal counsel. 2 board members from William Group, Clara, standing like a quiet sentinel in the corner, and Jessica's closest colleagues from New Path, who sat with a watchful, almost protective stillness. The church was old, its stone walls holding the scent of candle wax and time. Stained glass windows spilled muted colors across the aisle where Jessica walked alone. She wore a plain white dress, no veil, jeweled adornments, or bouquet to occupy her hands. Her natural curls were pulled back neatly, her gaze forward, unwavering. Stephen stood at the altar in a tailored tuxedo that fit like it had been sewn to his skin, every line of him immaculate. Yet the man inside that fabric felt unsteady. Deals worth billions had passed under his signature without a flicker of doubt, but now, with Jessica's calm approach echoing against the stone, he found his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the terms of their agreement. The officiant's voice filled the space, reciting the vows with the rhythm of someone who had spoken them hundreds of times before. When it was Stephen's turn, he said evenly, as though signing another binding contract. There was no tremor in his voice, no hesitation, just the polished cadence of a man accustomed to control. Then it was Jessica's turn. She paused, her eyes fixed on his, and when she said "I do," it was with the steady precision of a challenge accepted, not a promise of affection. "You may now kiss the bride," the officiant said. They didn't. Instead, they exchanged a nod, subtle, unspoken, and the ceremony moved on. The reception that followed was little more than an extended meeting. The tables in the small adjoining hall were set with modest floral arrangements. Waitstaff crept serving dishes that went largely untouched. Stephen was a gracious host, speaking in low tones to his associates. Still, his eyes drifted often to the back table, where Jessica sat alone reviewing architectural blueprints for a planned vocational training center. She didn't glance up when he looked her way. Later, the Bentley carried them back to the penthouse 68 floors above the restless city. The elevator ride was silent. Stephen gestured toward the guest suite down the hall when the doors opened. "This will be your room," he said. Jessica stepped inside without comment, taking in the modern furnishings, the pristine white bedding, and the untouched air. "Thank you," she said curtly, closing the door behind her. Stephen returned to the living room, pouring himself a measure of whiskey. The glass felt heavier than usual. He stood before the window, looking out over the glittering skyline that had constantly reminded him of conquest. It felt like a city on the other side of glass tonight, untouchable, indifferent. In the days that followed, the distance between them did not close. It widened. Jessica rose early, leaving for New Path, before Stephen finished his first cup of coffee. She returned late, and her evenings were claimed to be spent planning meetings and community events. When they crossed paths, their conversations were short and functional. Stephen left a small jewelry box on her desk one morning, in an uncharacteristic attempt to bridge the gap. Inside was a diamond necklace, rare, exquisite, the kind of gift that had once been enough to seal mergers and buy loyalty. When he returned that evening, the box was still there, closed with a sticky note pressed to the lid in looping handwriting. "I need a computer lab for the kids, not diamonds." He read it twice, the neat letters cutting sharper than any rejection he had faced in boardrooms. This wasn't his refusal, but a refusal of the currency on which his entire life had been built. Stephen felt the quiet sting of irrelevance, realizing that his wealth and influence meant nothing here for the first time. And though he didn't yet know it, the first crack in the armor he had worn for decades had just been made. Not by force, but by a woman who wouldn't bend. It was a Thursday evening when the words slipped from her lips. Not a request, not even an invitation, but something closer to a command. They were sitting across from each other at the long dining table in the penthouse. The space between them felt wider than the polished mahogany stretched from end to end. Stephen had been speaking about a meeting with foreign investors, and his tone was calm and deliberate. Jessica had listened silently, focusing on the simple meal she'd prepared for herself, roasted vegetables and brown rice. When he finished, she set down her fork and looked at him, her expression unreadable. She said that if you want to understand me, come to the center at 9 o'clock. Leave at center. Staten almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. And if I don't, then you'll keep talking about understanding things you've never seen. She stood gathering her plate, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her footsteps fading toward her room. The next morning, curiosity outweighed pride. Or perhaps it was the lingering edge in her voice, the way she had looked at him, without flinching, without awe. The Bentley stayed parked in the garage. Instead, Stephen arrived alone, dressed in dark jeans and a simple black sweater clothes that felt unfamiliar against his skin, though they hung as perfectly as anything tailored for him. The new Path Center was alive with movement when he arrived. The old converted warehouse bore the marks of its past life, weathered, brick-high ceilings with exposed beams and patches of peeling paint. But inside, the air was warm, infused with the scent of coffee brewing in the corner and the sound of chatter that carried the texture of a community. Volunteers moved between tables, sorting donated clothes and labeling boxes of canned goods. Jessica stood near the entrance wearing a green New Path t-shirt, her hair tied back. She didn't smile when she saw him, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. "Follow me," she said. The first task was simple sorting vegetables in the kitchen area. Piles of onions, carrots, and tomatoes waited to be divided into bins. Stephen pulled on the gloves she handed him, bending over the work table. His hands were precise, his movements deliberate, the same meticulousness that had once negotiated billion-dollar contracts. Yet here, under the watchful eye of an elderly volunteer with wiry gray hair, his confidence faltered. "That bin's for the spoiled stuff," the woman corrected him, plucking a tomato from his pile. "You're mixing them." Stephen looked at her, startled. He wasn't used to being corrected, not in public, and certainly not with such casual ease. But instead of bristling, he nodded, adjusting his work. Hours passed with the slow rhythm of ordinary labor, sorting, packing, and carrying boxes from one end of the warehouse to the other. No titles, no negotiations, only the steady hum of people working side by side. At noon, Jessica led him into a small classroom at the back of the building. A group of children sat clustered around low tables bent over workbooks. "Math tutoring," she said, handing him a chair. "Let's see if you're better at this than sorting tomatoes." A girl with frizzy hair and a shy smile pushed her paper toward him. It was a quadratic equation. He glanced at it, then at her expectant face. Slowly, carefully, he explained the steps, his voice gentler than he realized it could be. When she solved it correctly, her giggle was like a spark in the quiet corners of his mind. It was a strange, disarming feeling, not triumph, not victory, but a lightness from something entirely outside the world he knew. By the time the day ended, the warehouse had emptied, leaving behind the faint scent of soap and the quiet creak of settling wood. Jessica handed him a cup of water, placing it on a scarred plastic table. "That's my day," she said. He took a slow sip, watching her. "You're better than I thought." Her gaze met his, steady as ever. "It's not that I'm better. It's that you've always been looking in the wrong direction." The words landed in him like a shard of glass, sharp enough to cut through the polished veneer he wore like armor. Stephen felt the urge to look away for the first time in years, not because he was disinterested, but because he didn't know how to meet that truth head on. When he returned to the penthouse that evening, the city lights seemed different. Not smaller, not dimmer, but somehow further away. And though he would never admit it out loud, Stephen William suspected he had just taken the first step into a world he couldn't control and wasn't sure he wanted to. The following days settled into an odd rhythm, if it could be called that. They lived under the same roof, but not within the same life. In the mornings, Jessica was gone before Stephen even left the bedroom, and the faint clink of a mug in the kitchen was the only trace of her. When he sat down to his usual breakfast, poached eggs, pressed coffee, financial briefings, spread neatly across the table, she was already at New Path, surrounded by blueprints and volunteers, instead of marble floors and glass walls. For a man who had spent decades believing influence was the currency that opened every door, her indifference was an enigma. She did not thank him for the surge of funding that now flowed into her organization. She didn't ask about investment portfolios or linger in conversation to impress or be impressed. Her world moved on with or without him. One afternoon, Stephen stood in the hallway outside her room, holding a small jewelry box. Inside, nestled against black velvet, lay a rare, icy, flawless diamond necklace. It was the kind of gift that had once melted resistance, a gesture that in his life was shorthand for both apology and conquest. He set it carefully on her desk, imagining the surprise, the softened eyes, when she found it. That evening he returned from a late meeting to find the box still there, closed. On top was a sticky note in looping handwriting. "I need a computer lab for the kids, not diamonds." He stared at the words for a long moment, the paper feeling heavier than the stone it rejected. It wasn't anger that filled him, nor the sting of pride wounded. It was something quieter, far more unsettling, the awareness that in this place in her world, the things that had always defined his worth meant nothing. The next morning, Jessica appeared in the kitchen, wearing jeans and a New Path t-shirt, her hair pulled back. She poured herself a coffee without looking at him. "You looked at that necklace like it had insulted you," she said, casually, though there was an edge beneath the softness of her voice. "I thought it might be appreciated," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "But beauty that sits in a box changes nothing. 10 computers would." Stephen leaned back against the counter, studying her. "Don't you want anything for yourself?" Her eyes lifted to meet his. "I have what I need. The rest is for them." That answer, so simple, so absolute, stayed with him long after she left for the day. Later that week, she returned home earlier than usual, a folder of project proposals tucked under her arm. She found him on the balcony, the city stretched out like a map of victories won. She said, "You keep looking at this place like it's enough stepping out beside him. But it's just a box in the sky. You could lose it tomorrow, and the world would still turn." Stephen's jaw tightened. "And what would you have me do?" "See beyond what you can buy," she said. "Stop measuring life in transactions." Her words were a challenge, but not a cruel one. They were steady, rooted like the woman herself. And though he didn't answer, something inside him shifted a fraction, a crack. Long after she had gone to bed that night, he found himself pacing the living room. The lights of Chicago shimmered in the glass, but his reflection looked strange. A man in an expensive suit standing in a room built to impress, yet feeling for the first time that none of it belonged to him in any way that mattered. The next morning, he surprised even himself. He canceled a meeting, traded his usual pressed shirt for a plain sweater, and drove back to New Path. He didn't tell Jessica he was coming. By noon, he stood in the storage room breaking down cardboard boxes alongside a teenager wearing sneakers. No one asked him for donations. No one asked him for his name. They handed him a broom and pointed him toward a dusty corner. For hours, he swept, stacked, carried, and with each small task, The weight of his usual world seemed to loosen. When Jessica passed through the room, she didn't comment. But there was a flicker in her eyes, brief and unreadable, before she disappeared into her office. Stephen realized then that this was not her world alone. It was a place where titles dissolved, where value was measured, not in wealth, but in presence. And for a man like him, stepping into that was more dangerous than any deal he had ever made. Because here, the currency he had always trusted was worthless, and something far more costly was beginning to take place. Saturday morning came cloaked in a thin veil of rain that blurs the city's edges and dampens every surface to a soft sheen. Stephen might have spent such a morning reading the Financial Times over a plate of perfectly poached eggs in his private club. Instead, he found himself parking his car on a cracked street outside New Path, the wipers ticking slow, rhythmic arcs across the windshield. Jessica had told him the night before in her quiet, decisive way, "Be at the center at 9. Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty, and leave the part of you that gives orders at home." She was waiting when he arrived, standing beneath the faded awning, hands in the pockets of her rain jacket, her curls pulled back into a no-nonsense knot. She gave a brief nod of acknowledgement, then turned without a word, leading him inside. The first thing that struck him was the noise. Not chaos exactly, but a layered living hum. The shuffle of feet, the clatter of dishes stacked in the kitchen, the soft click of keyboards in the computer lab. The warehouse smelled faintly of old wood brewed coffee and the fresh produce that volunteers unpacked at the far tables. Jessica handed him a pair of gloves for vegetable sorting. "Start there." He glanced toward the tables piled high with plastic bags, leafy greens, wilting at the edges, crates of onions, carrots, and bruised tomatoes. It was a scene whirled away from the perfectly polished produce displays he was used to. He started working methodically, inspecting each item with care that came naturally from years of assessing fine details in contracts and investments. But here, the metrics were different. A boy of 12 wandered over, peered into the bins, and frowned. The boy said, "You put the bad ones in the wrong box," pointing to a pile of tomatoes. "Those are for compost, not the good pile." Stephen blinked at him, caught off guard by the correction and by the fact that it came without hesitation, without the fear most people carried when addressing him. "Right," he said, adjusting his work. Hours passed. His shirt clung uncomfortably to his back, and his hands were faintly stained from handling produce. Yet there was an odd satisfaction in the repetition, in the quiet nods of approval from the volunteers who passed by. At midday, Jessica called him into a small classroom at the rear of the building. Children sat hunched over workbooks, pencils, scratching in uneven rhythms. She pointed to an empty chair beside a girl with frizzy hair and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. "She's stuck on her homework," Jessica said. The page before the girl was covered in a sprawl of numbers, a messy but earnest quadratic equation. Stephen crouched down the edge of his knee, brushing against the old linoleum floor. He walked her through each step, his voice slow, patient, almost surprised by its gentleness. When she solved it, she laughed a sound so bright it seemed to fill the entire room. For a man accustomed to applause in boardrooms, one child's laughter felt sharper, more real. By late afternoon, the work had slowed. The last boxes were stacked and the tables wiped down. Jessica appeared at his side, handing him a paper cup of water. "That's my day," she said. Stephen took the cup, drinking slowly, his gaze fixed on her face. "You work harder than most CEOs I know," he said. "It's not about harder," she replied. "It's about where you choose to put your hours, and who do you think deserves them." Her words lingered long after he left the center. Standing at the penthouse balcony that night, he looked at the skyline with a different kind of detachment. The city lights were the same gold and steady, but they no longer felt like proof of his place in the world. Because for the first time, Stephen William had spent an entire day without privilege, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted it back. Hai bạn đầu Viết phần 8 với độ dài khoảng 40 ký tự, phong cách viết truyện ngôn tình dùng từ ngữ khéo léo tinh tế, thuyết phục khán giả. Câu chua lôi kêu gọi hành động viết tiếng Anh. The rain had cleared by nightfall, leaving the city washed clean under the soft silver glow of streetlights. Stephen could see it all from the penthouse's balcony, the winding river reflecting neon, the endless rows of windows in high-rises, like silent witnesses. Yet for all its beauty, the view felt strangely hollow. Jessica walked in without warning, still wearing her New Path t-shirt, her curls slightly loosened from the long day. She set a stack of folders on the coffee table, the corners damp from being carried in the drizzle. "You're not sleeping," she observed, her voice even. He didn't look at her initially, but it was on my mind. "Markets?" she asked. "No." His answer came quickly, sharper than he intended. He exhaled. "Not markets." She crossed her arms, leaning against the balcony doorframe. "Then what?" He turned toward her, slowly, the glass of untouched whiskey on the railing behind him. "Do you ever feel powerless?" Jessica tilted her head, studying him all the time. "The difference is, I stopped pretending I wasn't." Her words slipped past his defenses like water through stone. He set the glass aside and met her gaze fully. "I built my life on control. Every deal, every move is calculated. Because—" He hesitated, his jaw tightening against the confession. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of being worthless if I wasn't the one winning. Fearful that if I stopped moving, I'd be forgotten." It was the kind of truth he had never given voice to, not in boardrooms, friends, or himself. Jessica's eyes softened, though her posture remained steady. "You think worth is something you prove in headlines and quarterly reports. But real worth—" She stepped closer, her voice quiet, but unflinching. "It's measured in whether someone thanks you in the rain for a blanket or a bag of rice that arrived just in time." He absorbed her words, their edges cutting into the walls he'd built over decades. Silence stretched between them, thick, but not uncomfortable. "I want to come with you this weekend," he said suddenly. "To do what? Hand out food? Whatever you're doing." Her gaze narrowed, as if searching for the motive behind his offer. "If you're coming to prove something, don't. I don't need another performance." Stephen shook his head. "I'm not. I want to come because, for the first time, I see myself in the people you help." There was a shift in her eyes, not belief exactly, but the faintest easing of the guarded line between them. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward the city, the wind catching a loose curl against her cheek. "All right," she said finally, her tone low. "But you show up ready to work. No speeches, no cameras. Just your hands." Something in his chest tightened, not with apprehension, but unfamiliar anticipation. That night, long after Jessica had left her room, Stephen remained on the balcony. The air was cold, the city alive beneath him, yet his focus was inward. For years he had chased control as if it were oxygen. But now, standing at the edge of this shift, he realized that letting go might be the first real breath he'd taken in his life. Saturday arrived, with a thin, lingering drizzle that blurred the edges of the streets. The air smelled of wet concrete and distant wood smoke, and the sky hung low in a dull gray stretch. Stephen stepped out of his car, in front of New Path's Hope Center, dressed not in tailored wool or pressed cotton, but in dark jeans, a plain turtleneck, and worn leather boots. He carried a heavy crate of milk cartons in his arms, the weight awkward, but grounding in a way that contracts and market reports never were. No driver was waiting for him, and no assistant was trailing with an umbrella. Children darted between the steps, laughing as they chased one another. One boy, no more than 7, barreled into him by accident, nearly toppling the crate. Stephen steadied the child with one hand. "You okay?" he asked. The boy stared up wide-eyed. "Are you?" The milk guy, Stephen hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Today I am." The boy grinned and ran off, shouting to someone inside. The nickname lingered in the air, like a small, unexpected badge. Inside, the center C. Enter center. The scene was a steady rhythm of work volunteers, moving along an assembly line of brown paper bags, sliding in loaves of bread, jars of peanut butter, and bundles of vegetables. The hum of conversation was low, but constant, punctuated by the sound of tape tearing and boxes shifting across the floor. Jessica stood by the far wall, arms crossed, watching him. Her face was unreadable, neither skeptical nor welcoming, just watchful. He joined the line without a word, sitting beside an older woman with silver hair, who sealed each bag with practiced speed. They worked side by side for an hour, his movements slower at first, then gradually finding a rhythm. The woman glanced at him occasionally, as though measuring the sincerity in his hands. "Are you that billionaire they were talking about yesterday?" she asked finally, her tone light, but not teasing. "I used to be," Stephen said, sliding a loaf of bread into the next bag. "Now I'm learning how to be a person first." The woman's mouth curved into a small, approving smile before returning to her work. By midday, the tables had been cleared and replaced with rows of boxes ready for distribution. Stephen helped carry them outside, where a line of people waited under the drizzle. Men and women wrapped in mismatched coats, holding umbrellas, patched with tape, children clinging to their sides. He didn't linger on their faces for long, but he noticed how their eyes shifted when they received a bag, a flicker of relief, a quiet "thank you," murmured under their breath. He had been thanked before in meetings, in interviews, in letters printed on fine stationery. But those thanks had always been transactional. This was different. Gratitude was not wrapped in obligation. It was raw, unpolished, and fleeting, but it stayed with him long after the bag left his hands. Later, Jessica approached with a clipboard in one hand. "We're going to the storage warehouse," she said. "I want you to see where everything starts." The warehouse was dimly lit, smelling faintly of dust and dried grain. Stacks of dented boxes and burlap sacks lined the walls. Jessica moved through the space with the ease of someone who knew every uneven floorboard. "Why do you want to be here?" she asked, stopping in the aisle between 2 tall shelves. Stephen's answer came without calculation, "Because there's nothing to hide here. No mirrors, no polished floors. Just the truth. Like you." Her steps faltered for a moment. She studied him carefully, as if weighing the intent behind his words. "Are you doing this because you feel guilty, or because you're afraid to lose me?" He met her gaze without flinching. "I'm doing it because you made me realize there's a life I've never lived. And maybe for the first time, I want to live it honestly." The air between them shifted, not softening but deepening, like the moment before a storm decides whether to break. Jessica didn't reply immediately. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. "Tomorrow we're handing out blankets to people experiencing homelessness. It might rain. Will you still come?" "Rain or cold," he said quietly. "I'll be there." Jessica gave a slight nod, her face still unreadable. Then she walked ahead, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Stephen followed, feeling something new take root, not the rush of victory, not the satisfaction of control, but the slow, unfamiliar pull of belonging. The rain came heavier than anyone had expected. It wasn't the gentle kind that softened the edges of the day, but a relentless, soaking downpour that turned streets into shallow rivers and soaked through clothes in minutes. The sky hung low and leaden, pressing its weight onto the city. When Stephen arrived at the Hope Center the next morning, the pavement was slick beneath his boots, and his sweater clung damply to his shoulders. He carried 2 boxes of blankets, without the protection of an umbrella, water dripping from his hair into the collar of his shirt. With a clipboard, Jessica stood under the awning, hooded up. Her eyes swept over him, once the wet clothes, the muddied shoes, and she gave a single nod before passing him a list of distribution zones. They didn't waste words. The sidewalks outside were already lined with people, men and women wrapped in thin coats, plastic sheets pulled tight against their shoulders, their belongings gathered in small, weathered bags at their feet. Faces turned toward the volunteers as each blanket was handed out, the expressions a mix of fatigue and quiet gratitude. Stephen worked silently, moving from one person to the next, a hand on a shoulder. A murmured, "Stay warm." The rain blurred the lines of everything, softening the sharp edges of the buildings, pooling in the uneven cracks of the street. It also blurred him no longer, a figure in an expensive suit, but just another pair of hands in the storm. Halfway through the line, a man with tangled hair and a beard streaked with gray stepped forward, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of recognition. "You're that billionaire guy from the magazines." Stephen paused, a wet blanket heavy in his arms. For a heartbeat, the instinct to deflect rose to smooth over, to laugh it off. But instead, he said, "I used to be. Today, I hand out blankets." The man gave a rough laugh, accepting the blanket and pulling it tight around his shoulders. So in the end, who's richer? Stephen didn't answer. The question stayed with him, heavier than the rain. When the last blanket was given out, his hands were numb from the cold, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. The volunteers began packing up, their movements slow with exhaustion. Jessica approached her clipboard tucked under her arm, droplets of rain sliding down her jacket. She led him into the storage room, shutting the door against the sound of the storm outside. The air was musty, smelling of old cardboard and damp wool. She stood across from him, arms crossed, her gaze direct. "What are you hiding from Stephen?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean I saw the way you looked at people today?" That wasn't pity, it was fear. "What are you afraid of?" He hesitated, searching for the deflection he'd relied on all his life, but the words didn't come. Instead, he lowered his head. "That if you strip away the suit and the money, I'd be one of them. That you'd see the real me, selfish, stubborn, deceitful, and stop believing in me." Jessica didn't answer right away. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled, rain-spotted piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly, revealing the marriage contract he had once placed before her. "I kept this," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "not because I needed a reminder, but to see if you'd ever have the courage to tear it up." Stephen stared at the paper, the ink blurred at the edges. His hand closed around it. No speech, no justification, just the slow, deliberate sound of tearing. The halves fell between them, the finality louder than the storm outside. Jessica's eyes didn't soften, but something in her stance shifted, a fraction of the guarded distance easing. For the first time since they had met, Stephen felt the weight in his chest lighten. Not because the wager was over, but because the rules had changed. And in the quiet of that storage room, soaked to the bone and stripped of every pretense, he realized he no longer cared about winning. He only cared about what came next. 2 days passed without Jessica setting foot in the Hope Center. The absence was felt like a hollow space in the middle of the room, not loud, not announced, but impossible to ignore. Stephen arrived early each morning anyway, sweeping leaves from the front steps, stacking crates in the storeroom, and serving breakfast to anyone who walked through the doors. He didn't ask where she was. He didn't call. By the third afternoon, the air inside the center felt heavy, the kind of weight that came before something important or dangerous. Jessica walked in just after lunch, the drizzle outside, tracing dark streaks down the windows. She wasn't alone. The man beside her moved with the practiced confidence of someone who once commanded a room. His hair was silver at the temples, his tailored coat bearing the faint scent of expensive wool. There was something sharp in his gaze, a precision that missed nothing. "This is Clarence Smith," Jessica said, her tone steady, "my father." Stephen froze. Not because she had never mentioned him, but because of who he was. Clarence Smith was a name whispered in certain philanthropic circles, known for running a prominent humanitarian grant organization. He was also known for being ruthless in how he cut programs and people he deemed unworthy. They sat in the small meeting room, the air so still it might have been holding its breath. "I didn't come to apologize." Clarence began, his voice low, measured. "I came because my daughter forced me to see something I have avoided for too long." Stephen glanced at Jessica, but her eyes were fixed on her father. "She told me about this place," Clarence continued, "and about you. I remember thinking she was wasting her time trying to build something from nothing. I even told her she had no business managing public funds. I was wrong." He reached into his coat and set a folder on the table. The cover bore his name in bold black ink, and beneath it, the words, "Personal donation pledge, $3 million." Stephen felt the tension in the room shift, but not break. "Why now?" he asked. Clarence turned his gaze on him, unblinking. "Because I've seen the way you look at my daughter. It is not like a man chasing money or image, but like a man trying to redeem himself, which is the only way he knows how, and because she still stands here working, even after everything." Jessica's face betrayed nothing, but her fingers tightened slightly on the arm of her chair. "This donation," Clarence said, tapping the folder, "is just a part of it. The rest will take more than a check." When the meeting ended, Clarence shook Stephen's hand with a firm, almost testing grip. Then he left, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Stephen and Jessica stood together in the doorway, the murmur of volunteers filling the space beyond. He studied her profile, the strength in her jawline, the calm in her eyes. "You should have told me," he said quietly, "that Clarence Smith was your father." She turned her head, meeting his gaze with a faint, wry smile. "As you should have told me, I was part of a bet." The words settled between them, not barbed but weighted with the truth they both carried. "I'm not the man I was that day," Stephen said. "I know," she replied, "but I still don't know who you are now." He looked past her through the door to the hall where volunteers moved with quiet purpose. "I'm still figuring that out. Perhaps I'm trying to rebuild from the ruins I made myself." Jessica didn't answer. She didn't need to. For the first time, their silence felt less like a wall and more like a bridge, narrow, fragile, but there. Friday morning came with a crisp, brittle cold that hinted at winter's approach. The Hope Center was quieter than usual, its usual hum of voices replaced by the steady shuffle of boxes and the low clatter of stacked supplies. Stephen was in the food pantry, sleeves rolled up, carrying a crate of canned goods toward the back, when Clara appeared in the doorway. She said, "There's someone here to see you," her voice unusually flat. "He's waiting in Jessica's office." Stephen wiped his hands on a rag, an unease settling low in his stomach. The moment he stepped into the office, the air shifted. Marcus Grant sat in Jessica's chair, like a man inspecting a prize he already owned. Immaculate in a midnight blue suit, his gold-plated watch caught the light each time he moved his wrist. A cappuccino sat untouched on the desk before him, steam curling lazily upward. Marcus said, "You're doing well in your new role," his smile sharp as glass. "That volunteer shirt almost suits you." Stephen closed the door behind him. "Why are you here?" Marcus leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "This is to remind you that the game isn't over." He slid a folder across the desk. "Remember the investment agreement I sent you last year? There's a subclause. If you terminate the marriage 6 months before, I will gain full rights to transfer the 8% equity stake in Carter Enterprises to my name." Stephen's jaw tightened as he glanced at the stamped amendment clause on the cover. "You thought you'd escaped the old world," Marcus continued. "You can hand out food and mop floors, but I'm still at the top, and I won't let you drag me down." Before Stephen could respond, the door opened. Jessica stepped in, her expression unreadable, a small red light blinking on the phone in her hand. "I heard you were the one behind the marriage bet," she said evenly. Marcus's gaze flicked to her, half amused, half wary. Jessica Smith, still as direct as ever. She set the phone on the desk, its screen facing upward, the recording light still on. "I need you to confirm one thing," she said, "that you placed a bet on a marriage using another person as an investment tool. Do you?" Marcus chuckled, the sound low and dismissive. "You think a recording will shame me? I don't feel guilty. I am a lawyer, and I do profit." Jessica didn't flinch. "And I do community." That evening, during the weekly community meeting at the Center, Jessica stood at the front of the room. The recording of Marcus's voice played through the speakers, his laugh echoing in the silence that followed. Then Jessica spoke, not in anger, but with the kind of clarity that left no space for misinterpretation. She said, "We don't need funding here," and her voice was steady. "We need integrity. And anyone who steps into this space intending to manipulate or treat people as pawns will answer to this community." The applause was immediate and unanimous, rising like a wave that filled the room. Behind the curtain at the side of the stage, Stephen watched her, the woman he had once thought to win over as part of a wager, now teaching him what authentic leadership looked like. By the time the meeting ended, Marcus's name had begun to ripple beyond the center's walls. Social media carried the recording within hours, and by nightfall, the man who once prided himself on his untouchable reputation was trending for all the wrong reasons. Stephen lingered in the empty hall after the crowd dispersed, the sound of Jessica's words still resonating in his head. This wasn't just her fight. Somehow, without him realizing it, it had become his too. But he also knew something else. The truth about the wager hadn't yet fully come to light. And when it did, the fragile trust he'd begun rebuilding with her might shatter again. The meeting hall was dark now, and the applause had long faded. Only the hum of the vending machine in the corner broke the silence. Jessica was stacking chairs against the wall when Stephen stepped out from the shadow of the stage. For a moment, he said nothing. She didn't look at him. She kept moving her hands, steady, her face unreadable. "I didn't know Marcus embedded that clause in the contract," he began, his voice low. Jessica straightened and turned toward him, raising a hand. It wasn't an angry gesture, only final. "I don't need you to explain the clause, Stephen. Her eyes locked on his. Please explain why you never told me the truth. Why did you let me sign an agreement you knew was built on a lie? The air between them tightened, as if even the walls were waiting for his answer. Because back then, he said slowly, I thought it didn't matter. I thought you'd never find out. And I thought, maybe it would work itself out somehow. He paused, the words thickening in his throat. But I was wrong. Jessica studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp enough to cut. Then she reached into the satchel slung over her shoulder and pulled out her phone. With a few taps, a familiar voice filled the empty hall, her own, from their very first conversation in her office. You said this was for the community, her recorded voice told him, but in truth, it was for your reputation. The playback ended. She slipped the phone back into her bag. I don't blame you for lying, she said, her tone even controlled. I blame you for treating me like a tool, for thinking you could buy respect instead of earning it. He took a step closer. Everything has changed since then. I've changed. What you and this center C, enter center have taught me. It's real. I don't want to go back to who I was. Then don't. She replied, but her voice had no softness. Please don't do it for me. Please do it for the people who count on you. Please do it for yourself. He nodded slowly, though something inside him ached at a distance in her words. She wasn't cutting him out entirely, but she wasn't letting him in either. Not yet. That night, Stephen didn't return to the penthouse. He stayed behind at the Hope Center, moving through the dimly lit pantry, folding blankets, and arranging shelves of canned goods. His hands worked mechanically, but his mind was a storm. Hours later, he stepped outside into the cool night. The street was quiet, washed in the pale light of a flickering lamppost. He leaned against the brick wall, his breath clouding, and let the truth settle in. Redemption wasn't a gift someone handed you. It wasn't even something you could ask for. It was something you built brick by unglamorous brick until the wall you once hid behind was gone. Inside, Jessica was still in her office, the light spilling in a narrow beam across the floor. He could see her through the window, bent over a stack of reports, her focus absolute. She hadn't turned her back on him, but she hadn't forgiven him either. And in that fragile space between those two truths, Stephen realized the next chapter of his life, with or without, would be decided not by words, but by what he chose to do next. 6 weeks passed. Not swiftly, not without weight, but with the deliberate pace of something being rebuilt piece by piece. In that time, Stephen became as much a fixture at the Hope Center as the scuffed wooden tables in the standard room. He arrived before the security guard, most mornings, carrying boxes from delivery trucks, his breath visible in the chill. Gone were the tailored suits and the polished shoes. Now it was worn boots, rolled-up sleeves, and the faint ache in his back at the end of each day. At first, the volunteers had watched him with the wariness people reserve for strangers who arrive in their world uninvited. They'd seen men like him before, or thought they had men who stayed just long enough for a photo op or a headline before vanishing back into comfort. But Stephen stayed. He stayed when the work was repetitive, when the kitchen smelled of bleach and overcooked pasta, when a homeless father shouted at him for handing out meals too slowly. He took it silently, bowed his head, and returned to serving. Jessica kept her distance. She no longer avoided him, but she didn't seek him out either. She watched from across rooms, read reports from team leads, and glanced at the occasional photograph of him hauling cement for the vocational center's renovation, or crouched beside a child in the literacy program. If she felt anything, she didn't say. It was the opening day of the new vocational training center that shifted something. The building had once been an abandoned factory, its windows boarded up its walls, tagged with the remnants of 100 forgotten summers. Now it stood bright and clean, smelling faintly of fresh paint and sawdust. Stephen had been there every step of the way, scraping floors, painting walls, hauling furniture, until his hands blistered. When the time came for speeches, the MC invited him to the stage. Stephen shook his head. "I'm not here to speak," he said quietly. "I'm here to listen." Instead, an older woman stepped forward, her hair silver, her hands weathered. She was once evicted from her home during a bank repossession, and the center C. Enter center helped her find shelter. She looked at Stephen for a long moment before speaking. "You didn't repurchase my old house for me," she said. "You built me a better one here." Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. The room went still. That evening, after the crowd had gone, Stephen was in the sleeping quarters folding blankets when he saw her Jessica standing in the doorway. She walked toward him and set an old worn notebook on the table between them. "My first Hope Center journal," she said. "I kept one page blank, for something I thought was impossible." Stephen opened it. The pages were filled with notes, budgets, sketches, and names of people who had helped and are still waiting to be helped. The final page was empty, the lines unmarked. "I'm ready to write something there," she said. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Does that mean you forgive me?" Her answer came with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I don't forgive the past, but I accept the present, and I want to see if we can write the future." He closed the notebook carefully, the weight of her words settling deep. For weeks he had worked without knowing if it would matter to her. Now she hadn't offered absolution, but she had offered possibility. And for him, that was enough. In that quiet, with the hum of the heater and the faint creak of the old building around them, they stood facing each other, not as adversaries, not as partners in a contract, but as two people on the cusp of something uncharted. It was a small stage in a forgotten neighborhood, nothing like the grand halls where Stephen William had once been the center of attention. The boards beneath his feet were uneven, the air carrying the faint scent of fresh lumber and autumn leaves. Rows of folding chairs filled the open lot, occupied by the people who had built this place with their hands, time, and stubborn hope. There were no cameras, no journalists, no investors. The only faces he recognized now were volunteers, families, children, and people whose names he knew because he had worked beside them. Jessica stood next to him, the old notebook in her hands. The last page was still blank, but not for long. She turned to him, her eyes holding that steady light he'd come to know, the kind that neither flattered nor judged, but saw. Stephen took the notebook from her, the paper worn soft from years of being opened and closed. In his own neat handwriting he wrote, "The first day of no longer pretending. The first day of living truthfully for something beyond myself." He handed it back to her. Jessica read the words in silence, then looked up. She didn't say anything, just placed her hand over his, her thumb brushing against his knuckles in a quiet acknowledgement. In the following weeks, the William Smith Initiative took root, a network of community centers each run locally, but united by one principle: no one is left behind. Stephen refused a director's title. He called himself an infrastructure advisor, content to do the work no one saw. There were no black tie galas, no public announcements. Change came in the form of warm meals, repaired roofs, and job training schedules pinned to bulletin boards. Stephen walked through the garden behind the newest center C, enter center, in the still golden light of early fall one afternoon. Jessica was sitting on a bench, surrounded by a group of teenagers, showing them how to draft a clean resume. He didn't interrupt. He just sat nearby watching her, in that unhurried way of someone who had learned the value of being present. When the students left, she joined him. They sat in silence for a while, the air between them easy, the kind that doesn't need filling. "What if you hadn't taken the bet that day?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, then out at the path winding through the garden. "Then I wouldn't have lost you, but I also would never have found myself." She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She leaned her head against his shoulder, not out of forgiveness for what had been, but out of a choice for what could be. The wager was long over. So was the man who had entered it. What remained was not a contract or game, but the slow, deliberate work of building something real, brick by brick, page by page. And perhaps that was the only kind of wealth worth keeping. If you've walked with Stephen and Jessica through every step of this journey, from the arrogance of a wager to the humility of change, I'd love to hear what moments stayed with you most. Share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like if their story touched you, and follow for more stories that prove love, in its most valid form, is built not in grand gestures, but in the quiet courage to begin again.